Thank you for coming. My purpose today is twofold. I would like to introduce you to the work that Amnesty International does. I would also like to introduce you in particular to Padre Alejandro Solalinde, who runs a migrant shelter in southern Mexico. How many of you have heard of Amnesty International? Who knows about the organization? Fewer than half? So let's start with that. Amnesty International logo is the candle with the barbed wire, and basically our motto is, it is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. So what the organization tries to do is shine a light on human rights violations wherever they occur. And that is basically what drives us, because a lot of times, let's say, for example, you have a prisoner who is being tortured. If nobody knows about it, this can go on indefinitely. But as soon as somebody says, hey, wait a minute, I know what's going on, and then, you might have reports or statements to the press, you might have people writing letters. Once that prison or the government where that prison is located, once they know somebody's watching, then oftentimes the conditions for those prisoners changes dramatically. So shining a light, right? Shining a light on human rights abuses. What is Amnesty International? We are an international grassroots organization, a non-governmental organization. That also means we do not get any governmental financial support. We also do not get any corporate support. This is entirely membership-driven. We have approximately 3 million members worldwide, and I think about 300,000 members here in the United States. It's an organization that started in 1961 in London. You had an attorney, Mr. Benison, who basically heard that 2 Portuguese students were imprisoned only for toasting to freedom, right? They were getting together in a bar, they were doing a toast to freedom, and that was enough to land them in prison. He was outraged, so he started to write letters. He started to write, also letters to the editor, right? So he published it in newspapers. He got the group organized, so that was how it all started. In 1977, Amnesty International did get the Nobel Peace Prize awarded, so it is a highly recognized organization, especially in the human rights community. The objective, as I just mentioned, to shine a light on grave human rights abuses around the world, also to conduct research and generate action to prevent and end such abuses, and to demand justice for those whose rights have been violated. So it's really quite broad. And what the work of Amnesty International is based on is the so-called Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. So all of this human rights in terms of modern international human rights norms comes about after World War II. So these 30 articles are going to sound familiar to you because at least when it comes to civil and political rights, you're also going to find them in the US Bill of Rights in the Constitution. For example, the right to equality, freedom from discrimination, the right to life, liberty, personal security, freedom from slavery, freedom from torture and degrading treatment, right to equality before the law, and so on. So Amnesty does have a presence in many countries around the world, not in every single country, but one of the strengths of the organization is that it has been historically apolitical. And what I mean by that is it does not matter what the government is. If that government commits human rights abuses, Amnesty is going to call them out on it, right? So during the Cold War, for example, Amnesty International spoke out against human rights abuses committed by what was then the Soviet Union, right? So it doesn't matter that it's, a communist dictatorship. They've also called out dictators who were right-wing dictators. So in that sense, the organization is apolitical. human rights is what our focus is, and if human rights abuses are committed, there is no government that we're going to shy away from critiquing, and that includes the US government as well. So because of that, our research is highly credible, and oftentimes our research then becomes part of, let's say, what the United Nations gathers, along with other NGO reports. So the reports and press releases are important to raise awareness. And it's also a question of giving voice to the voiceless. Again, if you're imprisoned in some dungeon somewhere, nobody's going to know about it, right? If Amnesty takes on your case, right, then it becomes public. And then oftentimes, and we've heard from prisoners who have been released, right, oftentimes they said, once your letter started coming, they stopped torturing me, right? So it's very, very powerful. Pressuring governments and companies to respect international law. And with companies, for example, you might have oil corporations who not only collude with governments to take land from people, but oftentimes are also complicit in having people murdered. So it also includes companies. Our advocacy initially was on behalf of political prisoners, and that's still very much at the core of what we do. And how we go about it, a lot of the work that we do basically has to do with either petitions or letter writing campaigns. We write to government officials, presidents, governors, ministers, attorney generals, and so on. Also, what Amnesty does is human rights education and training. In terms of the issues, definitely prisoners of conscience, right? That's what we started out doing. We were advocating for people who ended up in prison solely, for exercising their right to freedom of speech. But we also protect human rights activists, and one of the people we advocate for is Padre Alejandro Solalinde. Other issues we work on have to do with death penalty. As you may well know, the United States is the only Western industrialized country that still has the death penalty. So when it comes to prison issues in general, we are a throwback if you compare it, for example, with what's going on in the European Union. So death penalty is one of the issues, solitary confinement, prison reform in general. So we collaborate with some other organizations on these issues as well. Policing is another issue we take on. So Amnesty International USA, for example, had a strong presence in Ferguson, and that includes issues of police brutality and accountability. So trying to call, not just raise awareness, but also trying to call on police departments, sheriff's departments to be accountable, right? Our work on torture includes, for example, Guantanamo, and our work regarding discrimination and persecution. It's very broadly framed, so that includes, for example, LGBT rights and women's rights. But we also work on refugees and asylum seekers. And speaking of migrants, here's Padre Alejandro Solalinde. He runs a migrant shelter in southern Mexico, and people who come to his shelter travel from further south. So they come from Central America, they travel north to get to Mexico, and many of them come from Honduras, Guatemala, and some other countries. So by the time they reach Mexico, many of them have been on the road already for a very long time. He opened the shelter in 2007, and at that point already we had a massive crisis. As you may well know, we have probably on the magnitude of close to 2 million people who try to get to the United States every year. A big problem is that we only grant visas to ballpark 1 million, right? So our visas, the visas that our government issues, are woefully inadequate to really deal with this demand. And when it comes to migration, let me just point out that migration is a fact of life. I'm a historian, but it goes back further than the onset of writing. We have archaeological records. People have always moved around. People have always moved. Migration has always been a fact. It becomes a problem once we get to the modern nation state and once you get states that try to control the borders. But worldwide, we currently have 200 million people who work in countries outside of their country of birth. That's 200 million people. In short, this is a global problem. In short, the United States is not the only country that has to deal with migration issues, and therefore it's completely unrealistic to think that we can just deport people and then be done with this. It's unrealistic to think that we can build a wall and be done with this. The reason why people come, it's complex. Yes, some people come for economic reasons. A lot of people come because they fear for their life, because simply they cannot live where they are. It's become too dangerous. They've received death threats, they've been subject to violence and so on. So oftentimes it's a combination of reasons, but by the time people actually come up here, they have gone through unimaginable hell. Women, and that actually includes also teenage girls, when they decide to embark on this journey to travel north to try to come to the United States, they are advised to get on birth control because chances are very high that they're going to get raped, and in the very least they will not get pregnant as a result of that rape. So it's a huge problem. And people are amazingly, but not surprisingly, very vulnerable, right? So kidnappings, and a lot of that happens in Mexico. So again, these are not Mexicans, right? These might be Hondurans, Guatemalans. But if they travel through Mexico, there's a very high risk that they're going to be kidnapped, that they're going to be robbed, beaten, killed, or if they're kidnapped, that their kidnappers then try to extort their families, whether or not those family members are in Honduras, Guatemala, or oftentimes they also have family members here in the United States. So the risk is really extremely high. So when Padre Solalinde opened the shelter, at that point we already had a crisis, and approximately 50 other shelters are along that migration route, and what they offer is a meal, a bed, so momentary shelter. Many people have really suffered physically already, so some of them may have blisters on their feet, they may have wounds, they may have been attacked already, so their wounds will be addressed and so on, right? So they get very basic medical services, they're going to get food, they're going to get, a bed to lay their head down on. So legal assistance also, right? Many of them, as I mentioned, have already been attacked by the time they get to the shelter. The National Human Rights Committee of Mexico estimated that just in the first 6 months of 2010, over 11,000 migrants were kidnapped in Mexico, right? So this is not just a handful of people here and there. It really is a crisis that it's hard for us to imagine. And many of the women who are kidnapped, and especially if the families don't pay ransom, they're then trafficked, so there's a lot of sex trafficking going on in addition to labor trafficking as well. Now, when Padre Solalinde opened the shelter, he's a man of faith. He's a Catholic priest, and he knew that this would not be an easy job, but nonetheless he felt that he had to do it. But from that first moment on, his life has been repeatedly threatened. And here's what he had to say in a statement. The biggest challenge for me to overcome is the constant intimidation, harassment, and disrespect from people who don't want me to carry out my work helping migrants. Many local authorities, criminal gangs, drug traffickers want to get rid of human rights defenders. They think we get in the way because we do not have strong values or an understanding of faith and human rights. Despite all their efforts to stop us from carrying out our work, we must continue. I have met Father Solalinde. He was in Ithaca a few years ago. He also did a speaking tour throughout the United States, but he spent some time in Ithaca and I had a chance to meet him. He's really an amazing person, small by stature, but very, very courageous. He speaks truth to power. And he will also go to Geneva. He will talk to representatives of the United Nations. He will go before various human rights committees and speak. And I think because he is so outspoken, that has actually to some degree protected him, right? Because he's fairly high profile, so it would be more dangerous to kill him. Nonetheless, his life is at risk, as are the lives of people who work in the migrant shelter, and of course the migrants who come through. So what are we doing on behalf of Padre Solalinde? Well, writing letters to Mexican government officials, asking the government to protect him, the workers at the shelter, and the migrants who seek refuge here. The workers, and these are human rights defenders, right? They need to be able to do their job. And we're basically asking the government to provide protection so that they can do that. Also, the government so far has not been very interested in finding out who is threatening Solalinde and his workers, right? There's a real lackluster will as far as that goes. And that's also what we're asking. Investigate. Who are these people? Who are these thugs? Who are these gang members? Who are these police officials who are also involved, right? Who are the local government officials who are involved? You know, how is this corruption happening? And, you know, the government should investigate, right? Should be transparent in its investigation, and should also bring the people who are responsible for this constant harassment and intimidation to justice. We do actually have a law in Mexico. It's called the Law for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders and Journalists, and we're urging the government to actually make sure that this law is given full force, right? And some of that may also mean working with NGOs on the ground, working with other groups on the ground, as well as, of course, local governments. And also the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights has made a series of recommendations and has taken on Solalinde's case and argued that he and the shelter should be placed under protection. So that's another one of the demands to ask that the Mexican government follow those recommendations. So one of the things I would just like to stress again, it's really the international economy that plays a huge part in why people come up here, in why they cannot live where they are. And then, of course, part of the international economy is also the war on drugs, which causes all kinds of problems of dislocation of people. So the other thing I would like just to get you to think about it for a moment, and even if you get out of here and you graduate and you may get a job which you may or may not like. A lot of people in this country have jobs that they don't particularly like, but nonetheless you can do something meaningful, right? Even if it's in your free time, if it's volunteering, whatever that is, put your talents to use. You can in fact make a difference, and NGOs, non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty International is one way in which that can happen, right? It doesn't have to be a human rights organization, but it is one vehicle in which you can make a meaningful contribution and you can bring about changes. So Amnesty International, again, we've been around since 1961. Since then, about 47,000 political prisoners on whose behalf we advocated have been released. I'm not saying that each of those prisoners was only getting the support of Amnesty International. Oftentimes you have multiple groups working on that, but that's 47,000, right? There may be a lot of people that we cannot save. There are a lot of people we cannot get out of prison. There are a lot of people we cannot save from a death row, but 47,000 people we did get out of prison. So in short, human rights work may be very frustrating, but nonetheless, right, there can be successes, and there have been successes. So I would just like for you to keep that in mind. Yay.